Let me welcome everyone to this week's Future Trends Forum. My name is Brian Alexander. I'm your MC and host for the day, and I'm very glad to see all of you here on this autumnal day in the Northern Hemisphere. We have a wonderful guest to talk with today. I'm very, very excited about it. Before we bring him on stage, let me just introduce you to the forum, where it comes from, how it works, how it's supported, and then we'll get into our main discussion. So, Christopher, if you could just kick the next slide, please. So you should know that the Future Trends Forum is a spin-off from the Future Trends in Technology and Education project. That's a monthly trends analysis that's been going on for more than 5 years now, which lets us look back at major trends in technology and education, so we get a better sense of where they might take us in the near future. If you haven't had a chance to explore it, go to ftte.us, download a few sample issues, or just take a look at the hashtag FTTE, which, by the way, we'll be using for the next hour if you're on Twitter. Now, a key component of this is that both the report and this discussion occur at an international level. That we do not limit ourselves to a particular nation or even continent. As you can see from this slightly older map, we've been having conversations with people from all over the planet: North and South America, Australia, Central East Asia, Europe, the Middle East. It's really important if we're considering the future of education to see it at this global basis. We're really glad to be able to support that here. Now, we can only do this work with the supporters and generous sponsors. I'd like to acknowledge them, explain them, and then talk about how the Shitty technology works. So to begin with, we're grateful to NYSERDAT. This is a New York State nonprofit that helps get that state's colleges, universities, museums, and libraries online with fast bandwidth. We're very grateful for them for their generous sponsorship. We're also grateful to Shindig, because you can tell they make available this technology. So if you're new to it, or if you haven't used it for a while, let me just walk you through it and show you some of the important parts. So where I am, and where these slides are just for a couple of seconds more, is called the stage. This is where the presenter will be, this is where our guest will be, and this is where anybody can join us, as long as your microphone and camera are working. So this space, everybody can see. Now below us, you can see what I think of as the participant swarm. This is right now 40 plus people, each of whom is represented by a silhouette or a photo or a video feed. So right now you can take a look, say, at Dave Hooker, who has really nice headphones, very similar to mine right now, not to mention a good beard, and you can just see him looking perhaps abashed that I just mentioned him right now. Now all those people there you can look at, and if you want to talk to them, double click on their icon. And if they feel like talking with you, your two icons will click together like Lego bricks. You'll have your own private audiovisual bubble, which is pretty handy. We might use that today for some small discussion. Now, this is a discussion. What I'm doing now, talking to you and showing you PowerPoint slides, that's going to go away. The key thing about this hour is that we have conversations. And there are 3 major ways that you can participate in those conversations. So to begin with, if you look down the very bottom of the screen, there's a white strip which has some important icons. On the far left edge of it, you'll see little people's heads and a number. That shows you how many people are in the session right now. If you click on it, you'll get a kind of film strip view of every person who's in here, which is pretty neat. To the right of that, you see a little dialog box, like a comic book dialog box. If you click that, you get up pops a chat box. And that chat box is for you and the 18 or so people who logged in with you. And that chat box will be running throughout the entire hour. If you haven't used it yet, take a minute just to type in a little bit about your name and where you are today. Already you can see we've had some introductions, some comparison of weather, some really strange references to television, and of course, beard discrimination. But that's a really easy way to talk. Now, if you would like to ask us a question or pose a comment, click next to that little dialog box. You'll see a circle with a question mark in it. If you click that, you can type in a question or a comment, and we'll flash it on the screen and I'll read it out loud. Now, there's a third way, even better. If your camera and mic are working, and if you're in a spot where you can talk out loud, click that raised hand. That'll tell us that you want to join us on stage. And if you click that, join us, we can have a whole conversation. We can host right now about 4 people appear simultaneously. It sounds complicated. It's actually really easy to do. You'll be surprised. And that's a really convenient way to really take advantage of video conferencing technology. So 3 ways to interact. This is, again, all about discussion. We're very grateful to Shindig for making the technology available. We're also grateful to our horde of Patreon supporters. If you haven't seen this, Patreon is a crowdfunding site like Kickstarter or GoFundMe. And what it does is it lets you subscribe to support somebody who's making things you like. I am helping make conversations and explorations about the future of education. So if you go to patreon.com/Brian Alexander, you can contribute as little as $1 a month to make sure that projects like this keep going. We're very grateful. Really kind people who are there. Some of them are on this call right now, and we'd love to have you join us. So thank you. Now, that's the background, that's the technology, that's how this comes to be. Let me introduce our guest this week. I'm very, very pleased to have Satya Nitta here. He's the global head of AI solutions for learning at IBM Research. And he's about, I think, 4.5 hours southwest of where I am now. Satya works in automation and learning. And you'll know, if you're a repeated Future Transform visitor, that we've had many, many conversations about automation education. I'm really glad to have one of the world experts on it. Welcome, Satya. Can you hear us okay? Your mic is muted. You want to unmute that.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Perfectly, perfectly. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you for coming. I really appreciate the time. And behind you is a whiteboard glimpse into the secrets of AI and education, I hope.
It's old. I haven't erased the whiteboard in 4 years.
Well, now those are archaeological secrets. Excellent, excellent. Well, welcome, welcome. Just to begin, let me just tell everybody, I have a few questions I'd like to lead off with. But as we go, please chime in with all of your questions and comments. Again, use those 3 different channels. Don't be shy. I'm sure you're going to have a whole bunch of them that'll come up. So just to begin with, Satya, I was working through your LinkedIn page and looking through different traces of you online and trying to describe you to some people. And the best I could come up with was artificial intelligence guru for IBM. Could you narrow that down a bit? What exactly are you doing there at IBM?
Sure, yeah. No, I focus on artificial intelligence for learning technologies. So you can broadly do AI 2 different ways. One is you can invent kind of horizontal technologies and just go into core AI, or another is to take a particular domain or a technology area or an industry and solve industry-specific problems using AI. So I do the latter. I'm more of an applied AI technologist than pure AI scientist.
Excellent. That's a great distinction. What's an example of one of the industry-specific applications that you've worked on?
Right. So I think the best example I can give you is what we are working on, and which I'm very passionate about, which is a field called intelligent tutoring systems. So the whole idea is that we are attempting to create computing systems that autonomously tutor learners within a domain of interest that the learners have. It's long been thought to be a holy grail of AI from the early days. So that's an example of what one could do with AI in education. It's also one of the more aspirational examples.
It's still aspirational, right?
It's still aspirational. I mean, we do have working intelligent tutoring systems, but to build something that's at kind of a human level of quality across multiple domains is deeply aspirational.
Do you, right now, what are some of the successes of automated tutoring that you've seen, or that we recognize or that we have access to?
The field has been around about 30 or 40 years, and much of the work in intelligent tutoring actually comes from a few labs, very well-known labs in AI and in cognitive psychology. The most famous of these labs is the lab at Carnegie Mellon, where John Anderson spent much of his 80s and 90s essentially inventing this entire field. Right, but there are other very notable scientists who contributed, people like Marvin Minsky at MIT, John Laird at Michigan. All these people kind of pioneered and kind of threw the flag for ITS systems in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Right. So they have so over the
Nice.
decades they have done a lot of work, in particular in one domain, which is mathematics. Typically middle high school mathematics, typically algebra, and they've
Ah,
shown that in that one domain, you can actually improve learners' ability to understand the subject, to demonstrate learning, to transfer learning from things they learn to things that they have not been exposed to. And there has been, I think, a reasonable statistical correlation between working with an intelligent tutor and improved learning outcomes. So lots of great papers in that space.
oh, so that's middle school math, like algebra one, basic trig, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I think over the last decade or so, they've expanded to a lot more, topics in mathematics. But the best examples of successes in intelligent tutoring actually come from math.
What do you mentioned Carnegie Mellon,
Right.
which is connected to the one of my favorite learning apps, which is Duolingo.
Mhm.
Would you consider that to be an example of automated tutoring?
Um, s- it's halfway there, right? So I mean, I haven't actually played a lot with Duolingo, especially recently. But if they're doing any level of adaptivity or personalization to what you're trying to do, you could loosely consider that an intelligent tutor, although it doesn't fit the classical definition that those of us who work in the field really agree to. But any system, I mean, these have been around a long time. Any system that autonomously adapts, whether the adaptation happens because you've written a bunch of rules behind the scenes, or if it happens because it actually did some assessments and decided to take its own diagnose where the learner doesn't take its own actions. Either which way, the notion of a computing system that's making a decision and doing something different for you can be broadly considered adaptive or adaptive learning, and it's one of the seeds for intelligent tutoring.
I was wondering about that. So that's a kind of early stage, or
Yeah,
not even stage, but a seed. Okay,
right.
thank you. This is a fascinating field. So much potential to revolutionize much of what we do. In case, sorry for if I didn't mention before, Duolingo is a language learning application. So you can just download that and play with it. I can talk with it if you like. Do you find? Oh, I have so many questions to ask about this right now. What are some of the really exciting trends and projects that you see happening now in terms of automated tutoring?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk a little bit about some of the challenges, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the ideas that excite me, right? Um,
Okay.
so one major challenge we have with intelligent tutoring is that knowledge, as we understand it, is actually connected in highly intricate ways. So for instance, when a human is working with another human or even having a conversation, we're relying on a massive amount of background information about the world, and we're marrying that to a lot of foreground information about how my conversation is going with the other person. Are they baffled? Are they engaged? Are they bored? Are they angry? Are we resonating? Are we moving the conversation forward? So all these things are things humans do exceedingly well. And right, so really one of the major goals here is to build a system that does a little bit of both, that figures out this intricate interconnection between knowledge. I'll give you an example of that in a second, and to also figure out from all kinds of cues, right? Keystrokes, body language, gesture, facial expression, etc. Whether somebody is actually engaged or not, right? Of course, there are major privacy implications here, which we should address and which we hopefully will have a chance to. But a really good tutoring system attempts to mimic both aspects of what a really good human tutor does. No one's actually ever built anything that sophisticated yet, but there have been a lot of notable advances in both fields. But there are lots of challenges. In fact, one would suggest that advances in attempting to determine a human's level of engagement are actually further along than advances in connecting all the background knowledge together and telling a computer that all these things are interconnected in ways that are non-intuitive or non-obvious. So these are right. These are some major challenges. And in terms of a computer, basically understanding human interactions, it's a whole branch of computing that's sprung up over the last several years. We call that affective computing, and it's surprisingly effective given the recency of the field.
So that's one of the exciting ideas.
Yeah. So in terms of another exciting idea, so just to elaborate further on this, connection between knowledge. What I mean by that is, let's say a student is having difficulty in math, and this happens a lot to my kids. Word problems tend to be things that stump them. Right. So are they having trouble understanding it because they didn't understand one of the words, because they didn't understand the context? And I'll give you a kind of a funny recent example from my 7th grade daughter's math homework. Right. So where is this coming from? And then how do I know as a computer that this is the specific problem? And how do I know that the problem is related to the domain as opposed to something else, or related to a different domain that I'm not actually working with right now, is an area of great research, and it's a very exciting area. So the example is about a week or two ago, my daughter was doing some problems in algebra. So the problems have to do with trying to understand negative numbers, right? So there's a fairly classical problem that goes, an iceberg is about 20 feet above the water and it's 80 feet below the water, right? So what is the total height of the iceberg? And so 80 feet below the water is minus 80 feet, and 20 feet above the water is plus 20 feet.
That's right.
And how do you get 20 minus 80 to get to 100 is something that stumps a lot of middle schoolers. Right, so she could tackle that, and then the next question was something to do with a football game, right? So a particular play happens in football, and in the first, I don't follow football, but bear with me for a second. I think in the first play, the team gains 6 yards. In the second, it gains 8, and the third, it loses 10. And so there's both positive and negative numbers, and it's addition of positive and negative numbers. And my daughter was completely stumped by it because we don't watch football at home. I don't follow football; it's never on. And she had absolutely no idea what to make of it, and the context was lost on her, right? So as a human, I could understand that the problem wasn't that she didn't know how to add two numbers, one of which is a negative number. It was actually to do with the context of the game of football. But as a computer, how does a computer actually understand that? I drew upon my background knowledge of the game, but a computer doesn't have that, right? So these are the kinds of fascinating challenges that we deal with.
So we go back to your problem of the dynamic between the industry-specific, task-specific automation versus the horizontal one. And this is a case where what looks narrow, trying to understand algebra, then branches out through reference. That's a huge. I can see that. We have our first question who wants to come up on video. So if we could beam them up on stage, they can join us. That's oh, good. That's Jeannie. So we'll see if we can make sure her audio works. Hello, Jeannie.
Hi, Brian.
Welcome. Are you okay to talk and ask questions?
Yes, I have my question written out. So recently, Science Alert announced that Google ML has learned to replicate itself. How quickly do you think this will actually evolve? in terms of utilization within AI learning supports, given the amount of training data that's readily available with actual student behaviors within these kinds of systems?
Great question.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it'll take time. One of the issues with education is while the field is in some ways data rich, the people who actually work in the field on AI are actually very data poor. We're a good example of a team that's building a lot of technologies, but we don't have data that's very specific to the types of tasks we're attempting to do, right? So it's a very classic problem in machine learning that we call the cold start problem. You're starting with a cold engine, basically, right? And so you have to use a bunch of techniques before you can step up to building more sophisticated statistical techniques, right? In fact, the larger abstraction here is virtually everything you read about in AI today in the popular press actually happens because somebody went in and they had a ton of data and they fine-tuned the living daylights out of the algorithms for that very specific, very narrow task, right?
Right.
And if you're in one of those fields where you're and in one of those companies where you're lucky enough to be sitting on a mountain of data for the specific task you want to do, then you can do some pretty cool things and pretty sophisticated things. But to generalize that and to suggest that we'll make all kinds of advances because one particular team managed to get an unsupervised learning problem solved is a little bit of a stretch, because the reality is the world is full of all kinds of complexities and problems and lots of issues with data, and even to do something like medical reasoning or diagnosis is exceedingly complicated with a lot of data, right? So I think we're probably a decade or two away from anything like that in learning.
I'm wondering, are you familiar with the Education Advisory Board? They're a company based in DC.
No.
The reason why I mention them is because they do a lot of work and they have mounds and mounds of data that they've collected from institutions, higher ed institutions across the board in the US. But it's all on advising data, and it's tracking advisor behavior in terms of how they're advising students. And they've got chat data, they have, interaction data, and they also have tutoring data. And what they're being tutored on, how they're being tutored, all of those different kinds of components. And then the other component that they have is actually all of the grades of the students, et cetera. Now, what they've been doing is some internal work in trying to utilize typical data analytics to be able to look at some of what the data is actually trying to tell them. But I'm wondering if there could be a partnership there between what you're doing and them to see if we can actually gather some additional information to help design more precise student success outcomes. So for individualized or tailored personalized student learning purposes, right? So by population, at least in terms of the way that the data is actually collected so that it can be anonymized. Is that something that you guys would actually be interested in or have the bandwidth to actually do?
Yeah, we'd certainly be interested in at least an exploratory conversation and a first conversation. A lot of it, of course, depends on what they'd like to do, what we'd like to do, whether it aligns strategically, and what the nature of the data they have is, right? So you mentioned actually a couple of different what we call use cases in there, both of which are of interest to us. The first is around student advising, or even things like college placement. Is a very classic, kind of thing that AI can automate and AI can do pretty well. And we'd be interested in that. A couple of years back, we had a series of conversations with the Jack Kent Cook Foundation to build an advisor, what we call a kind of an AI agent that will help high school students figure out which colleges to go to. Ultimately,
this is advising for college students in their major to make sure they graduate.
Yeah, even that. I mean, so they're all somewhat related. We actually had a similar program, a project that we did with the university in Australia a couple of years back, where we were trying to advise college students on not which major, but which courses and which classes to take within a university, right? So this is all of interest to us, and this does become a data intensive problem, and so I'd certainly be interested in having a conversation.
Yeah, they've got millions of data points, just because they collect the historical information,
Right.
and so when we sent over information, it's 10 years worth of student information that we sent to them, and that's how they collect the data for everybody, because they're using a component of predictive AI to be able to do some other things. But I'm thinking that if there was a partnership between them and IBM, because they're sitting on such a huge data source, that could really, really valuable opportunity to develop something more pinpoint for us in terms of the users.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, I'd be happy if you could, put us in touch.
Yeah, I'll connect you with their VP around that.
Thank you so much.
I'm so glad you both came today. That's excellent. Thank you, Gene. And if you want to stick around, please feel free. Thank you for the excellent questions. And Satya, thank you for the very generous answer. This is, again, a classic problem with data. I had more questions, but we have more questions from other people. Christopher, do you want to flash the question on the screen? Or just copy it to me so I can share it? This is from E. Maxwell, who says that you mentioned that Duolingo wouldn't meet the classical definition of AI. What is that definition, and where does it fall short?
Right. Actually, if I said it was classical definition of AI, then I misspoke. What I meant was classical definition of an intelligent tutoring system. Right. So an intelligent tutoring system typically does three things. One is it kind of assesses your current state of knowledge of a particular domain. So in this case, let's say you're learning Spanish. Again, I haven't spent much time with Duolingo recently. I did look at them a couple of years back. But if you log in, it will spend some time trying to figure out, are you a beginner? Are you an expert? Are you an intermediate learner? What are your learning objectives and goals? Right? That's the first thing an intelligent tutor does. The second thing it does is it determines where you are, and based on that, it will go through a series of learning activities. And with each learning activity, as you're actually going through the learning activity, it will observe, how you're progressing through the activity. And then the last thing it does is it makes some decisions by itself based on your progress or based on your, responses. And it will determine what other learning activities are suitable or what confusions you might actually have within a particular learning activity that are suitable for you. So I do want to contrast that from adaptive learning a little bit, right? So adaptive learning, Newton is very well known. I think Duolingo does this as well. And a majority of what you call personalized learning today falls into this bucket. Adaptive learning is broadly a set of recommendation systems. It's a bit like what you do on Netflix or on Amazon. Every time you log into Amazon, it'll say based on your buying patterns, you might be interested in this. Sure. Or based on your movie watching patterns, you might be interested in watching, Narcos or House of Cards or something. Right? Right. Right. So these are recommender systems. So they're all AI techniques. They're all machine learning techniques. Right. They're fairly well-known techniques. But where these things fall short, and adaptive learning techniques are very similar. They will say based on what you read and based on your responses, you might find something like this very useful, or you might, or I think I detect some confusion about an underlying concept, and I'm going to kick you down there. So where they fall short is, so classical intelligent tutor, if I go back to the example that I gave above about the football game, a classical intelligent tutor works with the student on every single problem. So on every problem, it will say, I have a version of the right answer, a version of the truth, a version of how to solve this problem, if there are multiple steps involved. I'm going to see how you're going through step by step within this problem. And I will then figure out on step 3, there is some confusion, or on step 3, you made a mistake. And I will figure out if I can give you a hint to help you address this. Right. So it's very human-like in that, when you're actually working with a person, you're saying, oh, well, I think you had a little bit of a mistake here. You don't simply tell them, I don't think you understand this. Go back and read the underlying concept, which is basically what an adaptive learning system does. A tutor, on the other hand, says, you don't understand this, but what if I give you a hint? What if I stretch your knowledge a little bit? What if I ask you a question like this? What if I push you? I'm trying to help coach and guide you to answer a question, right? So that's really broadly the distinction between an intelligent tutor and adaptive learning, or at least that's how I'd like to distinguish them.
That's very, very rich, and at the same time, very clear. E. Maxwell, I'm sorry, I don't have your full name, but that's a terrific question. Thank you very much for that. We have another video question come up. Christopher, if you could beam them on stage, that would be good. And again, remember, folks, you can use the chat box, and you can also use the question button to ask a text question. It looks like we have Jonathan Parts coming up. Let's see if this works.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello, Jonathan.
Hi, John.
Hi. So can I ask what's going to sound like a quite aggressive question? I don't really mean it that way. I think there's enormous amount of possibility for in tutoring systems, automated systems, everything. I just have a concern that we be careful within this community not to oversell what we're talking about. And so here's the specific line of reasoning I wanted to make. So I'm a math professor. And when my students have trouble, they come to my office. I do tutoring with, one-on-one meeting office hours. It's like tutoring. And so compare me to an intelligent tutor. So when the students ask me questions, the craziest thing that I never thought of, I never anticipated come up, and I have to try different explanations. And the dialogue I have with the student is very unpredictable, very human, very filled with, as you were mentioning, kind of associations with other things. Now, suppose we did a similar thing where I'm actually not talking to my student, but I'm connected to my student through a screen chat thing. And the student has another screen, which is connected to one of these intelligent tutoring systems. And the student doesn't know which is the human and which is the intelligent tutoring system. It sounds to me like we're doing the Turing test. So it seems to me that when people make a big claim about intelligent tutoring systems are going to be able to really do quality tutoring, what they're claiming is that they have AI which will pass the Turing test. Its essential equivalent, tutoring well, is essentially passing the Turing test. So since we are nowhere close to passing the Turing test, it seems to me that we shouldn't try to sell this machine learning and big data can help all sorts of very specific situations and help our students in certain ways. But until we can pass the Turing test, something like a real intelligent tutor is overselling what we're going for, isn't it? Or am I misunderstanding something here?
No, I think I think you're absolutely right. So if I came across as overselling it, it's my bad. I thought I'd started with a very clear suggestion that we're quite a way short of any level of human-like tutoring, quite a way short, right? The reason why intelligent tutoring is very relevant now is for situations where across the world they don't have people like you teaching them, right? What we're really building tutors for is for extremely non-uniform standards of education that exist globally, right? There's many places in India where I come from where there's barely any qualified teachers around. So can you build a computing system that will autonomously work with students and give them something in the complete absence of nothing, right? That's really the kind of problem that we're going after with intelligent tutoring, right? It's never really our intention at this point in time, at least, to attempt to beat a human in a tutoring task. It's really about supplemental tutoring, supplemental learning. And we're quite a way short of attempting to do anything human-like. And you're absolutely right. Doing it human-like is a little bit akin to passing the Turing test.
Okay, thank you.
That's a great question. It's a great question, and it's always a risk. And what's the joke, Satya? AI is always 10 years ahead or 10 years out.
Yeah, it's a bit like I keep telling my physics friends about fusion, cold fusion. Right? They always keep saying 30 years away, right?
That's right. It always is.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I don't know when anybody will claim to pass the Turing test. I mean, it happens every year. Every year there's some headline about some that passed the Turing test, and you look into it, and they cheated in some fashion. I think the latest one was pretending to be a 14-year-old Eastern European speaker of the English language and attempting to beat the computer, right? So, I mean, but passing a real Turing test is enormously challenging. I don't even know that anyone seriously attempting it, although our friends at Google are always up to something or the other. So you never know, but I don't know that anyone's anywhere close to it at the moment.
Well, I wonder if I could, Jonathan, while I have you on here, if both of you could answer this question. Came up in the chat. Let's see, this is Victor Aloise, who wants to know what you would recommend for a AI tutor for college level math. Is there anything that's really that great right now that you point to? So not a video, service, not Khan Academy, but an actual tutoring software.
Yeah, so there's a tool called Alex, ALEKS, which is provided by one of the large textbook publishers. I forget if it's Cengage or Pearson. McGraw-Hill, there we go. Which attempts to do something what our guest was talking about classifying first the amount of knowledge that a student has, and that's usually, I don't know if it's sold as a product standalone for self-learners, but I think it's often used in the context of a school system, again, under-resourced, and so you, instead of the students will go to computer labs and work away on this Alex tool to and if you don't have mastery at a certain level, or if you demonstrate that your mastery in a previous unit is not sufficient in the middle of the next unit, it will move you back to the previous unit. So it does do a lot of those interactive sorts of things. I don't know of any others really that are publicly available.
Well, on behalf of the interrogator, thank you. That's a good answer. Victor, I hope that works for you. So we've got math, language that we've discussed, and now we have Fred Bashirs. What would you like to ask?
Hi. Well, you've heard this from me before, Brian, but maybe it'll be new for your guest. Does it make sense to have the people who are working on intelligent tutors team up with the people who are working on intelligent digital assistants? It seems like, to me at least, that both groups would rely on having extensive, in the case of a tutor, an extensive learner information profile. And in the case of an intelligent digital assistant, the more the intelligent digital assistant knows about the user, the better it would be able to serve that user. So in the case of, for example, chess, you could have a virtual tutor that teaches you chess. And then if you wanted to play advanced chess, the kind where a team of a computer and a human plays another team of a human and a computer, it would seem that if your partner in that competition knew a lot about you, was in effect had been your tutor, it would be better able to serve you or work with you in that competition.
So you cut out a little bit right at the beginning of the question. So the question is, would it make sense for these two communities to collaborate, the tutoring community? Okay, yeah, no, thank you. Actually, the communities do collaborate. Intelligent tutoring is just a special class of intelligent digital assistants. Actually, it's not necessarily a special class. It is a class of intelligent digital assistants. So you have today you have all kinds of digital assistants, and to address Jonathan's question a little bit also here, Siri is an example of a digital assistant. Now, I don't know how much any of you use Siri if you have iPhones. I don't tend to use it a lot because it's fairly inadequate for what I'd like to do. But this is really where the state of the world is. There's a lot of things it's good at. There's a lot of things that tutors will be good at, but there's a lot of things that they'll be lacking. And the digital assistant world is full of hyperbolic claims, but on the other hand, they're also advancing technologies in very interesting ways that are of great benefit to our community. A specific example is Siri, Alexa, Google Home are all examples of chatbots, conversational systems. Our intelligent tutor also is front-ended by a Watson-based conversational system. So any advances that happen in the general field of conversational systems is something that we will take advantage of as an interface for the tutor to do what it's attempting to do. So in fact, these communities are actually very tightly intertwined.
Okay, and just one follow-up point. If most people are familiar with Freud's three-way breakdown of the personality, the superego, the ego, and the id, and in some respects, the virtual tutor is a lot like the superego. It's like your parent. It's teaching you. The ego is, like the warrior class that represents your interest in the world. But that leaves the human in the role of the id, which is a little bit embarrassing.
We're pretty good at that right now.
Well, I mean, I do want to, one quick point to make about that that's somewhat relevant is that in the early days of intelligent tutoring, when people like John Anderson and Minsky were attempting to build these, they actually were doing this with much more aspiration than what we're doing right now. Right? It's somewhat sad to say, but that's true. What they were attempting to do was to actually figure out and build models of how the brain processes information. And they call these things cognitive architectures. Marvin Minsky was famous for the Society of Mind architecture. Anderson started ACTAR and SOAR. All these are architectures that attempt to represent how the brain actually models information. Fast forward 30 years, we actually now know that we know very, very little about how human intelligence or biological intelligence works. And to a large extent, the field, including us, abandoned any attempt altogether to try to figure out, how the brain works or how the brain thinks or what kinds of constructs of psychology or personality or information exist in the brain, and we're attempting to solve a much easier problem and attempting to do this at scale. So there is a connection to psychology, to Freud's construct of mental models of the brain and tutoring, but it's now in the dust of history, and it'll hopefully be revived a decade or two from now when we know a little bit more.
It's a good question that pried out more on the history of AI as well as where it's headed. Friends, just want to remind you that you can see now how easy it is for people to pop up on stage and ask questions. You can see Jonathan and Fred there. If you would like to join us, please click the raise hand button. If you have more questions, just either click the question mark or type it in the chat box. Our chat box here has just had a huge conversation about the purpose of assessment that's still going on. Now, what? I have so many more questions to ask while people are still thinking about this. One comes to mind is, what do you see the role of a campus, a college or university in this now? Are we test beds for new software from IBM or Google or somebody else? What can we do to contribute to this process?
Yeah, I think colleges are a great test bed. They're also a great place for innovation. I'm a huge fan of a lot of the innovations that are happening in higher education today, both with and without technology and around technology. And I think colleges will continue to have a really central role in the future of learning for the foreseeable future. So certainly the work that we are doing benefits enormously from several pilots that we're carrying out in a bunch of local colleges, and we're learning a lot from the pilots. We're learning a lot from the professors who are working in sometimes hand in glove with us, trying to develop these things. And everybody understands that these are meant to be supplemental aids. So I'll give you an example of a project that we just signed that I'm very thrilled about and very passionate about. So a bit of history here. My father was a doctor. He was a professor of pathology, and I grew up with a whole bunch of medical textbooks, Gray's Anatomy and so on, at the kitchen table, and my dad correcting students' exam papers on weekend evenings and stuff. So, I mean, it always, once I got into this field about 4 or 5 years ago, the back of my mind was always this notion that I'd love to build a tutor for medical students. And so there's this university from Singapore that reached out to us a couple of years back. And after a couple of years of discussion, we just signed an engagement with them. It's called the Nanyang Technological University. It's one of the top universities in Asia. In fact, it is the top university in Asia and ranked number 11 globally. And they have an enormously talented faculty and a brilliant new medical school and a brilliant new AI neuroscience school that got established. So they reached out and they said, we'd love to build a tutor with you. We'd love to see what happens to the brain in the process of learning, all of which we are doing in our lab. So my lab, one of the things I left out is my lab also does some work in neuroscience. And so we signed this partnership, and the way they actually do their curriculum is quite fascinating. All the prep work happens. So a student actually works with the course material and potentially with the tutor before they ever come to class. So class is not for instruction. It's entirely for group discussion. So it's this whole blended or flipped classroom classroom model, right? And so you basically have a whole bunch of budding doctors, third, fourth, fifth year students sitting around a table, and the entire layout is a bunch of round tables. And they'll be discussing cases and so on, and they're expected to have done all the coursework and all these things prior to coming to class. So they think having access to a tutor would be enormously beneficial for these students if they have concepts they don't know, or if they need some help with reasoning or with diagnoses or things like that. Working with us to build something like that would be of enormous benefit, is what the aspiration here is. We just signed the deal. Over the next couple of years, we're going to be building this thing with them, and we'll see how it evolves. But it's a classic example of a university willing to roll up their sleeves and willing to work with us, and among other things, they're also very interested in what's actually happening in the brain when somebody works with an intelligent tutor or with some kind of an augmented reality setup. And right, so all these kinds of experiments and test beds can only happen when you have dedicated faculty, university partners, and scientists who say, this really is nothing more than a new tool in the long history of automated tools, and I want to see what this new toy can do for me. Right? So they have a very central role in my mind.
Well, it's interesting to see how that could really anchor in the flipped classroom, gone large. I'm also imagining ways in which you can really expand the curriculum that a university has available. So if you have a class in something that, for a small college or less well-researched university, to have a tutor available on something very, very specific. Epidemiology or pathology in ways that aren't normally accessible. In the chat box, we've had a couple of questions, and we have a few more text questions that we need to flash on the screen. So, Christopher, why don't you bring one up? This is, I'm not sure this is from, but the question is, how will machines recognize instructional problems and then apply solutions which adhere to instructional design principles? Good question, whoever asked that.
Yeah. I mean, so let me attempt to answer this. I'm not sure I can give you the greatest answer on the planet, but I'll attempt it. To a large extent, the questions that a machine poses within the context of a tutoring setup are questions it actually knows something about. In rare cases, in some cases, the machine itself generates an assessment. The design principles, or the principles by which it answers a question, are actually coded into the system. So in the absence of a larger architecture of how problems should be solved, right, which we don't have at this moment, we actually build into the machine some of the best principles that we know about how this particular lesson or this particular question should be answered. And then the machine's role really is to diagnose how the human is thinking through the problem, and to compare where they are to what it thinks is the reference answer or the gold standard, and to pop in and give some feedbacks, right? So it's a good question in that one of the things that we decided to do as a company when we got into this was I had a choice, which is, I was going to go hire a bunch of cognitive psychologists and domain experts in education, or are we going to be an AI team and a technology team? So we chose to go the latter route, but we were fully aware of the fact that to do this well, we need to actually partner with people who actually understand instructional design principles and so on. And so that particular choice happened to be a good choice, because we really wouldn't have been able to keep a bunch of education specialists and cognitive psychologists happy in a building full of mathematicians and computer scientists and physicists. So today, where we do get all that information and all that knowledge is from our partnerships. So we partner with universities that have this. We partner with Sesame Workshop in early childhood to tell us a lot about how children learn at that age. We partner with Pearson in higher education. We partner with the New York Hall of Science to do supplemental mathematics, tutoring. And in every one of these cases, the partner brings to us two things. They bring content and they bring domain expertise. And we marry them with algorithms and technology. And that's basically how we address these kinds of questions.
Well, that's a fantastic question. And I love how your answer got to go through a whole variety of areas. And again, come back to that crucial point where faculty are both domain experts and also pedagogical experts. We have more questions, and we're at the last 8 minutes of our session. We've got more questions coming up. This is from Jessica, who asks, regarding decision making, helping or even teaching modeling decision making. The question is, where are you seeing innovative opportunities in this? In healthcare yet?
Yeah, healthcare is the classic area where the science of decision making is advancing. It's been around a long time. I mean, so decision making isn't especially new in computing, right? Today, for instance, if you fly any long haul flight, the plane is making a number of decisions by itself in an automated fashion, right? And a lot of these decisions are fairly straightforward, open and shut decisions, and a lot of them aren't especially complex decisions. Nonetheless, the machines making decisions isn't. I don't want to pretend that it's entirely new. I mean, another great area where decision making is advancing is in driverless cars, right? So to address that, in driverless cars, right?
Yes.
Google driverless car. So to address that specific question, I think the two areas where decision making is advancing is definitely in healthcare and in autonomous cars. These are the two places that are more or less at the forefront of the AI field.
Thank you. That's a great question. And we haven't mentioned autonomous cars because there's so much to discuss, and we're really focused on automation for education. There's a question from Roxanne Riskin, who wants to know about journal resources for neuroscience-based evidence for AI. Roxanne, if you want to add more to that, I can ask. But I would quickly ask one question about this, which is, Satya, for people interested in this field now, what are the best places for them to keep up with it? What are the best sources besides, say, MIT Tech Review?
If you Google intelligent tutor and you go to Google Scholar, there is a review paper that came out last year. I'm really blanking on the specific authors, but that Google Scholar tends to be a very, very good place to go for the latest publications. And the publications, by the way, they're not very heavy in that, halfway through it, there might be a whole bunch of math and there might be some stuff that you might want to skip. But if you read the abstract and the conclusion, which, I'll let in on a dirty secret, we do a lot because there's so many papers. We scan abstracts and conclusions and only dive in when the paper is of interest to us. If you read the abstract and the conclusion, you get the gist of what the paper is about, and that's a great way to keep up with the publication. Typically, look at publications from 2 or 3 years out rather than something that's immediate, because if a publication is really making all of us sit up, then we're all citing it. And so a publication that came out in 2014, 2015 that already has several tens to hundreds of citations is something you want to pay attention to. Something that just comes out, that's something much more in the realm of domain experts. It's harder for someone who's not in the field to figure out how relevant it is, or how innovative or breakthrough it is. But if you look at anything that's 2-3 years out with lots of citations, it's actually a fairly important finding.
That's really important. I mean, since there's so much buzz and hype around this, I think for a lot of good reasons, we have to remember to go back a few years and draw attention to the really significant research.
Right.
Good question, Roxanne. Thank you. We have, oh my gosh, we're almost out of time. We have time for one more question. And this, I'm not sure who this is, but this is a question about learning software that learned to replicate itself. Let me see which link this is. I'm not sure if it's the neural network that managed to redo. Yeah, it's the AutoML project.
I just read that this morning, actually. So it's very recent. So I don't yet know what they're doing. My immediate guess was that it was an example of unsupervised learning. So again, this goes back to a question that we had earlier in the chat. So unsupervised learning is really kind of the vanguard of machine learning today. Just to explain that, unsupervised learning is where you turn a computer loose with a whole bunch of data, and it figures out some patterns and learns something by itself. A great example of it was, I think, a couple of years back. Google fed in a few million videos from YouTube of cats, and a program was able to recognize a cat, right? So unsupervised learning techniques are around. They will advance. Again, they're data driven. It's basically a class of deep learning. And they will do the specific things that the data lets them train themselves for. So I want to stay away from any larger implications of unsupervised learning becoming really intelligent, because that's a bunch of science fiction. But if you have enough data, you can definitely get computers to do some fairly intelligent things like recognizing things themselves or replicating themselves. All this is in the general area of unsupervised learning. But about 99% of AI today is all labeled supervised learning. Somebody is training computers with a bunch of labeled data being annotated data, and then computers are taking patterns from it.
Unsupervised learning is a fantastic phrase. I can see misusing it in all kinds of ways to describe my family, for example. But this is, I hate to pause you right now, but this has been so rich, Satya. This is like the first day of a seminar on automated tutors for learning. I want to thank you so much. We have more questions coming, but I'm conscious of your time and our sessions. So let me just thank you very, very much. I'll follow up with email afterwards, but I do want to thank you for being so generous, so thoughtful, and teaching us all so much.
No, thank you so much. It was a genuine pleasure. It's one of these forums I really enjoyed. And the questions were all deeply insightful, provocative, and very thoughtful. Thanks for the questions.
My pleasure. The forum people are quite brilliant. Maybe we'll follow up with you in a year and see where this is going.
I'd be delighted to come back.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I'm afraid we have to wrap things up. Let me just put a couple of quick notes for next week and where things are going. So first of all, next week we should have Dean Dad, Matt Reed, VP for Learning at Brookfield Community College, a widely read writer about community colleges and how they're changing. An incredibly accessible guy, really, really engaging writer. If we're interested in diving into that sector, which in the United States is responsible for educating roughly 45% of us, I think this is going to be one of the stars of our show. I'm so glad to have him out here. Now, also between now and then, our book club reading has begun. Our current book is Weapons of Math Destruction. Speaking of big data, this is Kathy O'Neill's very, very accessible, very passionate critique of big data, data analytics. We've already read the first two chapters, and the next two chapters are coming up on Monday. So please go to the blog to catch up, and I really, really recommend the book if you haven't read it yet. On top of that, let me just remind you that we have a survey going on for what you think about this forum and where it should go next. If you haven't had a chance to fill it out, please do so. And if you'd like to learn more about the Future Trends in Technology Education Report, go to fed.us. If you want to learn more about this technology, go to shindig.com. And otherwise, we'll see you next week, and we'll see you online. Thanks so much for coming. Bye-bye.